The mountain was all light and noise. Snow glared back the midday sun so fiercely the air itself seemed to burn white. On a narrow shelf carved into the side of the ridge, a U.S. patrol was pinned flat against the rock. The world shrunk to the width of their cover and the small, jagged slice of sky above. Rounds chewed into stone inches from faces. Chips of ice and rock spat into eyes and mouths. Every time someone dared lift their head, bullets slapped the ledge, snapping over helmets and packs, driving them lower. "Stay down," the squad leader bellowed, voice tearing in the thin air. "We're in the open. Diaz, I need that net." The radio operator twisted the dial with numb fingers, headset pressed so tight it cut into his skin. All he got was a hiss, a broken whisper, then nothing but a wall of static. "Platoon, this is Alpha 1, we're..." His word drowned under another hammering burst from the ridge across the canyon. The medic crawled, chest scraping ice, to where a private lay on his side, gloved hand clamped over a thigh already darkening the snow. "I got you. I got you," the medic said, voice too calm for the chaos around them, fingers working at trauma shears even as bullets ricocheted off the rock inches from his ear. The wounded soldier's breath came in short, terrified gasps. "Doc, Doc, I can't feel." "You don't need to feel it. You just need to keep it," the medic muttered, yanking a tourniquet tight. Look at me, not the blood." Another burst from the opposite ridge stitched the rock above them, showering them with dust. The platoon leader flattened his face into the snow, heart punching his ribs, then forced himself to look up. For a heartbeat he saw beyond their little shelf, out into the vast, indifferent sweep of the mountains. Sheer slopes drop into a shadowed valley, then climb again into an opposing wall of rock and ice. There, dug into dark cracks and shallow scrapes, enemy fighters worked their guns with terrifying discipline. A heavy machine gun sat on a carefully leveled platform, its barrel rocking in a measured rhythm. A spotter beside it peered through high-powered glass, calling adjustments, adjusting fire like he was shooting on a range. They weren't spraying. They were sculpting the kill zone. The officer's gaze flicked higher, toward the jagged crown of rock that loomed above and behind them, the peak they designated for overwatch. White Peak. Nothing moved up there, just a jagged tooth of granite and snow against the sky. He swore under his breath, ducking as a round snapped past his cheek. Overwatch never made it off the mountain, he muttered, half to himself, half to the rock. Down on the shelf, men shouted over the dead radios, mouths moving words that never left this slice of cliff. "Hop, this is Alpha 1. Say again, static. White Peak, do you copy? Static. Overwatch, where the hell are you?" Their voices vanished into the hiss. Far above them, where the air thinned and the wind cut like glass, someone listened to the same emptiness and heard gunfire echoing up the canyon. On a protruding spine of rock near the summit, a lone figure lay prone, wrapped in white over white camouflage that blurred the lines between human and snow. Only the barrel of her rifle broke the illusion, jutting out past the lip of the rock like a steel icicle. She exhaled slowly, watching her breath drift away in a pale cloud. The cold bit into her fingers through thin shooting gloves, but her grip never wavered. One eye stayed pressed to the cracked glass of her scope. Through it, the world below came into sharp relief. The narrow shelf where her people hugged the rock, the muzzle flashes strobing from the opposite ridge, the little movements that gave away each enemy firing position. They thought she was already gone when the ridge blew. The narrator's voice rolled in, distant and steady, as if coming from somewhere just above the wind. They were wrong. On the shelf, the squad leader screamed into his dead mic again, spit freezing on his lips, desperation rising with every unanswered call. "White Peak, this is Alpha 1. Any station. We are in the open and taking accurate fire. Say again. Static hissed back at him like a taunt. His men shifted, hearts pounding, eyes cutting toward the cliffs around them. Some remembered the rocket strike earlier, the white flash and roar from up above. They'd watched part of the peak disappear in a cloud of snow and shattered rock. No one had seen any movement since. For them, Overwatch existed now only as a line in the mission brief. a checkbox that had been ticked and then erased by the mountain. Across the canyon, enemy fighters adjusted their positions with professional ease. The spotter lifted his optic, glass catching the sun. He smiled faintly as he followed the path of a tracer, corrected, then snapped his fingers once to signal the gunner beside him. The next burst pinned 3 Americans in place, cutting off their only zigzag toward better cover. High still, the camera pulled further up, over the pinned patrol, up past the carefully constructed enemy line, to the rear of the formation where 2 figures hugged the rock and watched the cliffs with different eyes. They wore the same winter kit as everyone else, but their gear was stripped down. Small packs, carbines slung tight across their chests, harnesses cinched over layered clothing. One had a streak of dried blood on his cheek, already turning brown in the cold. The other flexed gloved fingers against the rock, eyes scanning the face in front of them like it was a puzzle instead of a wall. "Sir," the senior ranger shouted over the gunfire, angling his body to project his voice down toward the officer. "That route's gone. We stay here. We die here." The platoon leader looked back at him, shredded between 2 equally bad choices in a heartbeat. Behind the rangers, the rock face rose almost vertically, a slab of ice and stone with just enough shadowed seams and little notches to suggest possibility to someone who had spent years hanging off surfaces like it. To everyone else, it might as well have been a polished wall. The younger ranger tapped the rock once with his knuckles. "We can get up there," he said, voice low but firm. "If she's still alive, we can reach her." The senior ranger shot him a quick look. There were no ropes visible on either of them. No neat coil, no fixed lines. Just a handful of hardware clipped to their belts and the stubborn set of men who knew the difference between safe and necessary and were about to walk past it. "Free climb," the officer yelled, incredulous. "Only way," the ranger shouted back. "You want that gun shut down or not?" Another burst hammered the shelf. A man screamed, then cut himself off with a grunt, dragging his arm back into cover. Snow leapt, danced, and fell as bullets walked closer. For a moment, the officers stared at the 2 of them, their breath smoking in the cold, their hands flexing once on the rock as if they were shaking off doubt. Behind their goggles, their eyes were already up the face, tracing a line only they could see. He nodded once. It wasn't approval. It was surrender. "Go," he shouted. "If you can get me my overwatch back, go." The camera pressed close as the rangers turned to the wall. Their fingers found the first holds, rubber boot edges smearing into tiny depressions in the icy rock. There was no rope to catch them if they slipped, no safety net below, only the shelf, the men they'd leave behind, and the long drop into the canyon. One reached up and smacked a metal piton into a crack with the heel of his hand, more for rhythm than real security. They started to climb, slow and precise, bodies hugging the wall, becoming thin, dark shapes against the white. Their movement pulled the eye upward again. Above them, on the ragged spine near the top, the sniper stayed perfectly still. She breathed in. The sound of gunfire below came filtered, dull, like someone slamming doors in another building. The only loud things in her world were her heartbeat and the faint hiss of wind cutting around her position. Her broken scope lens threw a spiderweb across her view, but she'd already mapped which edges she could trust. Her gloved thumb nudged the zoom ring down, trading magnification for wider field and more forgiving glass. Through that cracked circle, something caught her attention. A figure on the enemy ridge, just behind the machine gun. Different posture, different gear. A man with a radio on his back, antenna coiled low, hand to his ear. Her mind filed it away instantly. Priority. Below, someone screamed her call sign into a dead radio, voice cracking. The narrator's voice dropped in again, sliding under the sound of gunfire and the labored breath of the climbers. To understand why they left her there, it said quietly, and why anyone would climb without equipment, you have to go back to the morning the snow was still quiet. The world flickered, sound stretching thin. Up on the peak, time slowed. The sniper's finger tightened on the trigger just enough to take the slack out. Her eye stayed locked to that cracked scope, tracking the distant line of the radio wire as it snaked back to a cluster of figures around something she couldn't yet fully see. The story froze on an image, one blue eye framed by the ring of the scope, glass broken into fine lines around a calm pupil. Snowflakes drifted across her lashes as gunfire thundered, distant and unfocused, from below. Then the mountain went silent, and the scene rewound. Hours earlier, the mountain had felt like another world. In the blue light before dawn, the forward outpost sat hunched against the slope, a scatter of low buildings and HESCO barriers half buried in snow. Rotor wash from departing helicopters whipped flurries into spirals that caught the rising sun and painted the air with gold. Inside the cramped briefing room, the world shrank to maps and muggy breath. A space heater rattled in the corner, fighting a losing battle with the cold sneaking in under the door. Men stood shoulder to shoulder around a scuffed folding table, shoulders wrapped in winter gear. Rifles leaned in a neat row against the wall. On the table, a tablet showed a satellite image of the valley, white on white, ridges like frozen waves. Grease pencil lines traced routes and contingency paths, little arrows marking checkpoints. Someone had drawn a skull near a narrow choke point as a joke. First Lieutenant Mason stood at the head, finger-tapping the route on the screen. "We step off in 40, he said. "We track this approach up to the crash site, recover the payload, then continue north to LZ Frostbite for pickup. Weather window closes at 1400, so we'll move light and move quick." The squad leader, Staff Sergeant Reddick, nodded, mentally counting the hours and terrain. "Enemy presence?" he asked. "Low," Mason said. "We've hit this valley before. They know the drill. Most of their fighters have moved down into the lower passes for winter. We might stir up a few sentries. Nothing we can't handle. White Peak here," he tapped a jagged high point on the map, "gives us overwatch on the crash site and most of the approach." At the far side of the table, the woman in the corner tilted her head. She wore the same outdoor layers as everyone else, but her gear was oddly neat, everything in its place. A long rifle case leaned against the wall behind her chair, dull finish worn at the edges from use. Her name taped read Harper, Staff SGT. She had a tablet of her own in front of her, a smaller one, the kind they issued intel teams. It displayed a slightly different view of the same valley, one with colored overlays and faint icons marking previous contacts, known enemy caves, routes, and suspected trails. While the others watched the big picture, she watched that one. Harper flicked between time-stamped images, the ridgelines shifting as snow accumulated. Cloud cover, melt patterns, the invisible fingerprints of human movement pressed into the landscape. Her finger froze over one section near High Saddle. There should have been a scatter of heat signatures there from a known cluster of huts. On older imagery, it had glowed faint orange and infrared. In the last pass, 2 days ago, it was dark. Mason was still talking. "We've got good comms with higher redundancy on the satellite link. If anything goes sideways, we call it up and adjust. This is a simple recovery, not a raid." Harper zoomed in on the dark saddle. Tiny pale lines arced away from it, newly cut trails in the snow, faint but visible if you knew how to look. They curved toward the canyon Mason had drawn their route through. "Sir," she said quietly. Her voice didn't carry far in the buzz of the room. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Sir." Mason paused, noticing her at last. "Yeah, Harper." She turned the tablet so the image faced him. "These huts on the High Saddle. Last 3 passes show heat. This week, nothing. But there are fresh tracks moving out from here, and here." She tapped along the pale lines, all converging toward this choke point in the canyon. Reddick snorted. "Or the goats migrated. There are no goat pens here, and no footpaths on older imagery," Harper said, evenly. "These angles are wrong for livestock movement. This looks like a redeployment." "Which could mean they've gone, which is good," Mason said, trying to keep the tone light. "We can't treat every empty hut in this valley like a trap, or we'll never leave the wire." Harper's brow furrowed. She pinched and zoomed again. "It's not just that. This saddle has always had some heat. Fires, cooking, something. Sudden zeros can mean they've gone cold to avoid overhead, not that they're gone. And this ridge here," she pointed to a narrow ledge overlooking the drawn route. "There are new disturbances along this line. Could be nothing. Could be firing positions. Around the table, a few heads turned. The radio operator, Diaz, leaned slightly to see, curiosity flickering in his eyes before he masked it. Mason exhaled. He wasn't dismissing her outright. He respected her work, but the timeline ticked at the back of his mind like a metronome. "Saddle's still on our flanks if they're there," he said. "We move with overwatch. We're not walking blind." Harper didn't argue. She'd been in enough rooms like this to know when to push and when to let someone walk into their choice. Still, she tapped the screen once more, highlighting a narrow strip of cliff above the crash site. "Then I want this spot," she said. "Hey, if they're shaping a kill zone, it'll give me eyes on both their positions and ours. I can call it in before they finish setting the table." Reddick grinned without humor. "Always did like the high seats." Harp. Something like a smile touched the corner of her mouth. "They're quieter." "Fine," Mason said. He pointed to the peak. "You and a two-man security element go out early. Take the steep couloir. Set up overwatch on White Peak before we hit the shelf. We'll feed you our movement. You call out anything that looks like more than goats and shadows." He shifted focus. "Comms. Diaz." Diaz straightened. "We've got primary on SAT, backup on loss relay, and data link clean. High is monitoring. Jamming's always a possibility in this valley, but last two patrols didn't see anything beyond handhelds. We're good." Harper's eyes flicked to him. "That jamming cell they hit west of here 3 weeks ago, they pulled custom gear off that site. We don't know who paid for it. If pieces of that kit migrated into this valley, they won't be trying to block our talk between squad and platoon. They'll go after our satellite bridge first. Cut the head off, then the limbs." Reddick rolled his eyes. "You're always planning for the worst, Harp." "That's my job, Sergeant," she replied politely. "Yours is not to walk into it." Laughter rippled, a touch too loud. It wasn't hostile, exactly. Just a practiced way of stepping around the discomfort of someone telling them the mountain might be thinking about them too. Mason checked his watch. "We don't have time to redesign the whole route. We'll go with the plan. You get your perch, Harper. If anything looks off, you sing out early and loud. Everyone clear." Around the table, heads nodded. Boots shifted, gear rattled as men began to peel off to ready their kits. Harper stayed a moment longer. She opened a small notebook from her pocket, the pages already stained and crinkled from time in the field. It wasn't standard issue. Flowing pencil lines traced alternate routes, contour sketches, little notes about wind patterns on specific ridges. She flipped past diagrams to a photo taped near the back. It was old, edges curled, corners softened. A younger version of her hung on a plastic old wall, chalk on fingers, hair tucked back, muscles taut in her arms and shoulders as she reached for a hold just beyond her full extension. There was no rifle in that picture, no rank, just a harness and a look that mixed determination and joy. She stayed at it for a second, thumb brushing the corner, then closed the notebook and slid it back into her pocket. Outside, rotor noise faded into the distance. The shadows of the ridges crawled as the sun climbed. The Rangers, Holt and Vega, entered the gear room where she checked her rifle one last time. Holt glanced at her pack as she tightened straps. "You packing for a climbing trip or a firefight?" he asked, eyes on the extra carabiners and a compact coil of cord tucked under the lid, along with a small emergency med kit. "Both," she said. She ran a cleaning patch through the barrel, watching it emerge clean. "You don't like options?" Vega smirked. "Most snipers we see bring more glass, less hardware. You planning to rappel off that peak if things go sideways?" "If things go sideways, I'll be glad for every ounce of metal I dragged up there," she replied. "You'll be glad, too, if you ever need a way down that isn't the fast way." Holt's eyes lingered on the gear, not mocking, just cataloging. "You climb?" he asked. "A little," Harper said. "Before this job." "Good to know," he said. "Mountains don't like people who act like tourists." She zipped the rifle case shut, slung it over one shoulder, and grabbed her helmet. "Then let's not act like tourists." They stepped out into the cutting cold, breath pluming. The sky over White Peak was a clear, brutal blue. The mountain watched them approach. By mid-morning, the patrol had snaked its way through the lower valley, boots crunching through hardpack. Harper moved ahead with a two-man element until the route split. Main body angled along the canyon floor while she broke left toward a steep couloir that clawed its way up to the ridgeline. The couloir was a gash of shadow and glare. She kicked steps, crampons biting into the crust as she climbed, hands brushing the rock walls for balance. Above, wind plucked at her hood, carrying faint echoes of their movement below. Halfway up, she paused. A distant crack rolled down from another valley. Not thunder, too sharp. A single shot, the sound warped by distance and terrain. Somewhere out there, someone was already working with a rifle. She turned her head, scanning. Saw nothing but snow and silence. "We're on a clock," her security man reminded her, puffing in the cold. "I know." She listened one moment long, reading the air like a second set of imagery, then resumed climbing. The mountain creaked quietly around them. By the time Mason's patrol reached the beginning of the narrow shelf that would later become their prison, Harper's boots crested the last lip of rock. White Peak opened around her. Wind knifed across the summit, dragging streamers of snow off the edges. She could see the crash site, a broken scatter of dark against the white on a lower shoulder. Beyond it, the canyon road they'd be taking, the opposing cliffs, the high saddle she'd circled earlier at the briefing. She dropped her pack, went to work. Rifle out, bipod down. Small spotting scope set on a rock, lens caps flipped. She adjusted her position until the angle felt right, then settled into the snow, letting her body melt into the ground. "White Peak to Alpha 1, she said, clicking on her headset. "Overwatch in position. I have eyes on the crash site and primary route. Send your movement." "Copy, White Peak," Diaz answered immediately, the line crackling but clear. Alpha 1 stepping off the shelf. "Good to have you up there." "Good to be here," she said softly. She scanned the valley, eyes moving in a structured pattern she'd practiced for years. Nothing obvious. No muzzle flashes, no movement on the opposing ridge beyond a few harmless rock slides. The high saddle looked empty as on the imagery, snow smooth and unmarked by fresh prints. Still, something pulled at the back of her mind. It felt like an empty chair in a room that should have been full. She flicked to her secondary net, keyed the satellite data uplink from her tablet. The live feed of the valley popped up, a ghostly mirror of what she saw with her naked eye. For a moment, everything was as it should be, coordinates matching, data streams green. Then a sharp tone pinged in her ear. The tablet screen flickered, pixelated, then froze. Icons stuttered, drifted a fraction of an inch off their true positions. "Diaz, confirm satellite link status," she said. "Reading green on our end," Diaz replied. "You having issues?" "Minor interference," she said. She gave the side of the tablet a light tap, like that would change the physics of the sky. "Keep me updated if Hire reports anything on the net." "Roger that, White Peak." Harper set the tablet aside, letting its frozen image sit beside the living one through her scope. She lined both up, searching for discrepancies. Down below, on the narrow shelf, Mason's patrol moved into the canyon. She watched them thread along the edge, little shapes against the cliff. Her voice stayed calm as she keyed the MIC, calling small adjustments to their spacing, their angles, their positions relative to the bends of the rock. Then, just as they moved into the tightest part of the constriction, as cliff rose on their left and dropped away on their right, the interference in her headset deepened, a faint hiss overlaying Diaz's voice. She adjusted the antenna, frowned. "Say again, Alpha 1, she said. "You're breaking up." "Copy, White Peak. We are." The rest dissolved into static. Harper's fingers tightened on her rifle. On the frozen tablet, one icon blinked out entirely. The snow may have still looked quiet from above, but something below had just taken notice of them, and was reaching up to close a fist. From the patrol's vantage point, the canyon was beautiful and cruel. The narrow shelf they followed clung to the cliff, no wider than a pickup in some places. On their left, the rock rose in a sheer wall. On their right, the world fell away in a steep slope of loose snow and ice down to shadowed trees far below. The sun had climbed high enough to pour light into the canyon, reflecting off every surface. It was like walking through the inside of a mirror. White Peak, this is Alpha 1, Mason said, squinting through his goggles. We're entering the shelf. Call anything that looks like it wants to kill us. Up on the peak, Harper watched them string out, using every outcropping and bend in the trail as cover. Copy, Alpha 1, she replied. Spread your spacing another 5 meters. You're bunching near the bend. And tell Reddick his rear fire team needs to pick up their interval. Reddick grumbled something under his breath but raised his hand, signaling his people to adjust. Boots crunched, packs shifted, the line flexing. Harper swept her scope across the opposite ridge. Shadows pooled in the cracks. A glint caught her eye, a brief flash of light that didn't belong. She backtracked, glass settled on the spot. At first, she saw only rock and ice. Then, as her eye adjusted, the shape emerged. A dull gun barrel poking through whitewashed camouflage, tripod legs buried in snow, the faint outline of a man hunched behind it. Her stomach tightened. Alpha 1, White Peak, she said. Hold up. I've got possible machine gun at your 1 o'clock. High, approximately 300 meters, concealed in a rocky outcrop. Recommend you shift closer to the wall and slow your pace by half. You in his lane. Mason hesitated, boots crunching to a stop. You sure? He asked. We've walked this shelf before. Didn't take any heavy from that angle. Positive, Harper said. She dialed the focus, catching a tiny movement, someone adjusting their grip. And I have what might be an antenna just below them. This looks structured. Reddick exhaled, annoyed. We're going to lose our window if we crawl every time Harp thinks a rock looks at her funny. Sergeant, Harper said, voice level. I'm looking at a tripod, not a rock. This is different than the last run. You're walking into a sharp tone cut her off. Her headset squealed, then flattened into static. The tablet at her side went black, then rebooted to a blank screen. Alpha 1, White Peak, radio check, she said quickly. Say again you're lost. Nothing. Diaz, this is White Peak. Confirm you hear me. Static answered, swallowing her. Harper's hand moved automatically through the basics. Check cables. Adjust connector. Flick the radio off and on. The noise didn't change. It wasn't her kit. Someone was stepping on their frequencies. Down on the shelf, Diaz flinched as the same shriek tore through his headset. He ripped it off one ear, thumb frantically working the dial. Comms just went like garbage, he shouted. Hi is still there. Mason demanded. Diaz tried the satellite net. This is Alpha 1, priority traffic. Do you read? Static washed over him. A green light that had been steady on his radio face flickered, then faded. GPS. Reddick barked. The point man checked the screen on his device. We're somehow facing south, sir. That's wrong, Mason said sharply. We're walking north. Then this thing's drunk. Up on White Peak, Harper set aside her dead tablet and trusted the oldest tool she had, eyes and intuition. She spun back to her scope, dialed it up. The glint she'd seen before reappeared, now clearly an optical lens tucked behind a chunk of ice, a spotter, glassing the shelf. The machine gun's muzzle tilted a fraction, settling into its starting line. Her blood went cold. Alpha 1, White Peak, break, she shouted into the dead net. Machine gun, direct front. Get off the... Her warning shredded into static as something on a distant ridge hummed to full power and flooded the air with invisible aggression. The enemy jammer had just come online. On the shelf, the first burst hit. Sound and impact arrived together. A long, ripping roar as rounds tore into the rock where they'd been standing seconds earlier. Stone exploded into dust. Snow vaporized in chunks, filling the air with a blinding white cloud. Contact front! Contact front! Reddick screamed, shoving the nearest man toward the inside of the shelf. Mason dropped to a knee, yanking a private down with him. Get low! Get low! He shouted, trying to project authority over panic. The canyon transformed in an instant. Machine gun rounds plowed a furrow along the outer lip of the trail, cutting off any attempt to drop over the edge. Rifle fire erupted from narrow cracks on the opposite wall, muzzle flashes popping like small, deadly fireworks. Somewhere behind the ridge, a hollow thump echoed, the unmistakable sound of a mortar tube. "Mortar!" someone yelled. "They've got her!" The first round landed short, down in the trees, sending a geyser of snow into the air. The second landed high, showering them with rocks and ice as it slammed into the cliffs above. They were in a shaped killbox. On the summit, the blast felt like the mountain had hiccuped. A concussive thump rolled up through the rock, making Harper's teeth rattle. She forced it out of her mind. She had seconds. Through the scope, she watched the machine gun trace another line across the shelf. Closer this time. Men flattened. One didn't quite make it. His leg took a burst, jerking away from his body as he went down. "Alpha 1, this is White Peak. You are in an L-shaped ambush. Pull back now," she shouted into the dead ether. Her words went nowhere. On the shelf, chaos folded into an ugly order. Reddick grabbed the wounded soldier by his carrier drag handle and hauled with raw strength, boots sliding. A burst of fire stitched along the ground where the man's legs had been a second before. Shrapnel bit into Reddick's arm, darkening his sleeve, but he didn't let go. "Move!" he roared at the rest. "If you stay here, you die here." Another mortar round whistled overhead, impacting somewhere uncomfortably close to the crash site. Snow and debris geysered, obscuring the wreckage. Enemy fighters emerged in half-glimpsed silhouettes from prepared positions, rifles chattering in disciplined bursts. They weren't just reacting. They were executing a plan they'd rehearsed. Harper ducked as a blast tore through the rock less than 10 meters below her position. An enemy rocket had slammed into the ledge she'd used to climb up, shattering it into a spray of broken stone and empty air. The shockwave rolled up over her, lifting loose snow, driving a roar into her bones. Instinct rolled her deeper behind her rock cover as shards of granite sliced above her head. When the dust settled into a choking fog, part of the route she'd traveled that morning was simply gone, a bite torn out of the mountain. Her rope, lashed to a protruding horn of rock near that ledge, dangled uselessly, its lower half severed. The cut end swayed in the wind like a frayed nerve. She blinked grit out of her eyes, coughed hard, and wiped the back of her hand across her mouth. It came away gray. She checked herself, hands running quick and clinical over limbs, ribs, gear. Alive. Shaken, but alive. Her scope had not fared as well. A new crack spidered across the lens, shifting the point of impact a fraction. Manageable, but another handicap. She eased back to her rifle and looked down. From her new, slightly shifted angle, she could see the crash site and the shelf, but the path she'd taken to get here had been erased. There was no easy, safe way down from this peak anymore. She was, in a very literal sense, stranded. On the shelf, Mason glanced up through drifting snow and smoke, catching a glimpse of the shattered rock high on White Peak. He saw no movement, no muzzle flash, only a scar of fresh stone against old. "Overwatch is gone," he said, the words like gravel in his mouth. He wasn't speaking into a radio anymore. He was admitting it to himself, to the mountain, to anyone within earshot. She never made it off that ridge after the hit. "We can't help her now. Focus on who we can save." Below the shelf, another mortar round landed, walking the impacts closer. The enemy was adjusting with precision, bracketing them, preparing to tighten the ring. Across the valley, Harper's scope picked out more details in their trap. She saw, now, how the snow on the opposite ridge had been subtly shaped. A smooth fan where an avalanche could be triggered, scraped clean firing lanes that carved through scrub and rock, narrow trenches dug behind ridges to conceal movement. Small mounds and the likely fallback paths that screamed mines to a practiced eye. They'd studied the game board and rearranged every piece. And they weren't just trying to kill the patrol. Her gaze cut to a cluster of figures near the crash site, enemy fighters sprinting toward the wreckage, bent low, rifles slung. One carried a hard case strapped to his back, another fussed with a camera on a tripod, aimed down into the canyon. They were going for the drone payload and the footage of a trap patrol at the same time. The mountain, she realized, wasn't just a battleground. It was a stage. Her throat went dry. She looked down at the severed rope, the vanished route, and the cracked scope in front of her. The radio hissed with dead noise at her elbow. The ambush had done more than isolate the patrol. It had deliberately cut her off the board. Harper took a long, slow breath, letting it out through her nose. The roar of mortar explosions rolled across the ridges like distant thunder. The mountain had told them, in the briefing room, something was wrong. No one had wanted to hear it. Now it was screaming. She settled her cheek back against the stock, ignoring the sting of stone dust. Through broken glass and swirling snow, she began to search for another way to reach the pieces of the game still left. Because stranded or not, as long as she had a line of sight, the fight wasn't over. For a minute, all she did was breathe and count. In, out, 1, 2, 3. The way the instructors had taught her years ago, when she'd first tied into a rope and trusted her life to her fingers. Her rope was now a useless, swinging tail in the wind. Her route down was gone. Her comms with Haya were shredded by an enemy jammer. Her tablet was a dead rectangle of plastic. She listed the constraints in her head without emotion, as if she were writing them on a whiteboard. No primary descent. No reliable radio. Cracked optic. Enemy heavy weapons emplaced with good geometry. Mortars active. Patrol pinned. Enemy forces closing on the drone wreck and their people. And herself, alone on a splintered peak. "What do you have?" she murmured under her breath. She had her rifle. She had her backup minisight. She had a compact radio that could still punch a short-range line-of-sight signal if she could get an angle. She had a small coil of cord, some slings, a handful of carabiners, and a brain that had spent years mapping movement across stone. She lifted her head, ignoring the way the world seemed to sway for a second after the rocket blast. The summit wasn't a flat plain. It was a knot of rock teeth and narrow ridges. From here, the only way down that wasn't a sheer drop seemed to be the path that had just been turned into a smoking scar. Unless she stopped thinking in terms of up and down. On the far side of her perch, the rock fell away almost vertically into the canyon, streaked with frozen runoff and patches of wind-scoured stone. It was the kind of surface that sent most climbers looking for another route. To Harper, it was a question. Not can this be climbed, but where does it go? She crawled to the edge and peered over, keeping her weight low. Cold air rushed up past her face, carrying echoes of gunfire. A line formed in her mind as she studied the face. There, a narrow ledge no wider than her hand, running diagonally across the wall like someone had taken a knife to the mountain. Higher up, a series of micro-edges stepped toward a knife-edge spur that jutted out into space, directly above the enemy mortar position and with a slant toward the crash site. The spur itself was nothing, a blade of rock with a cornice of snow clinging to it. No sane person would choose to stand on it, which, in her experience, made it exactly the kind of place no one expected anyone to be. Diagonal traverse, she whispered. Sideways. It was time to climb not for summit, but for angle. She turned back to her gear, movements economical. She stripped her pack down, pulling out everything not essential to shooting or survival at immediate hand. Extra clothing, some rations, stuffing it into a stuffed sack she could stash here and retrieve later, if later ever came. She took her slings and tied quick loops, prepping them to sling around any protrusion she might find. The coil of cord she split into shorter sections, knowing they'd serve more as emergency safety lines than true protection. Her spare magazines she taped together in pairs for faster reloads, then secured them close to her chest where she could reach them one-handed. Her compact radio, still functional but useless against long-range jamming, she unclipped and checked. The lost antenna glittered faintly in the cold light. If she could get herself into a position with clear sight down toward the ranges, she might punch through a short burst, even in the teeth of a jammer. It wasn't much, but it was more than nothing. Down below, on the shelf, Holt pressed his back into the cliff as rounds whipped past. "We can't stay here," Vega shouted over the gunfire. "They are walking us in." Holt's eyes cut up toward the shattered ridge. He saw, in his mind, the rope that had been there that morning, the path that had brought Harper up. He imagined it, now, dangling cut and useless. He imagined her still up there anyway. If she was dead, he said, more to himself than anyone. We'd be dead by now. Those guns would be shooting tighter. Someone's messing with their eyes. Mason crawled over. We're not getting off this shelf along the route we came, he said, voice tight. High is not answering, and if they've got mortar and heavy up there, they'll chew a retreat to ribbons. We might have to push through. So, Holt said, if she can move at all, she's going to try to get a better angle. If we can get up and re-establish Overwatch, she can dismantle this thing piece by piece. With what rope? Mason snapped. Look around. Everything that was safe this morning isn't anymore. Holt's eyes went to the wall above them. The straight up-and-down face, streaked with ice, pocked with the occasional sliver of a hold. Dangerous, sure. Insane, maybe. Impossible. He didn't believe in impossible. We don't need rope, he said. We need time and a bad idea. Mason stared at him like he'd suggested they grow wings. Free climb? In this. He jabbed a hand at the snow. The blasting mortar explosions, the bullet strikes. You've got a better option. Holt shot back. If we fall back, they take the payload and film us doing it. You know what they do with that footage. Mason did. Their faces, their uniforms, splashed across enemy channels as proof of weakness. Their own drone tech turned against them. Their goal isn't just to hurt us, Holt said. It's to humiliate us. They need a trophy. That drone's the trophy. We'll leave it. We give them exactly what they came for. On Harper's Peak, she clipped her rifle across her back, muzzle down, barrel wrapped in a sling so it wouldn't swing freely. She tightened her harness and tested her gloves against the rock, fingers flexing, feeling for sensitivity even through the insulation. She'd free climbed in worse. She'd climbed in better. She'd never done it with a war hanging off every handhold. One last glance through her cracked scope showed the mortar crew receiving another stack of rounds. The machine gun's barrel steamed faintly from sustained fire, but it still spat anger down the canyon. Near the crash site, she caught a glimpse of someone in civilian gear, hands bound, being shoved toward the wreckage. A mountain guide, by the look of his clothing, forced into helping. Her jaw clenched. Another variable. Another life. She turned away and stepped to the edge. Down below, Holt had made his choice. He and Vega dumped their packs, keeping only ammo, water, a few slings, and minimal climbing hardware. They checked each other's chest rigs, tightened straps, and looked up into the wall of rock and ice. Permission to go reconnect Overwatch, sir, Holt shouted. The phrase sounded absurd even as he spoke it, but it was the only way to package the insanity into something fit for a chain of command. Mason forced out a bitter laugh. You're insane, he said. He looked at the shelf, at the wounded, at the mortars creeping closer. Go. If you fall, I'll kill you. Understood, Holt said, offering the ghost of a grin. He turned to the rock and pressed his gloved fingers into the first handhold. The stone was cold enough to burn through the gloves, but the friction was good. He tested each hole twice before committing his weight, boots finding impossible toe edges that would look like flaws in the rock to anyone else. Vega followed a few feet below and to the side, giving Holt room in case anything came loose, because on this wall, one person's mistake could rip them both off. From the perspective of the pinned patrol, the two rangers began to crawl straight up into the sky. Back on the peak, Harper moved with the same slow, deliberate precision. Her fingers searched for holds first, not her eyes. She let the tips of her gloves feel for slight depressions, ridges, cracks where she could twist and hook. Her boots scraped, then settled, rubber finding purchase on ice-slick rock. Her world shrank to the span between her hands and her feet. The mortar blast became low booms. Machine gun chatter turned into distant static. Even the howling wind softened into a background rush. She slid along the wall, body pressed close, weight constantly shifting, every movement small and controlled. Spindrift cascaded from above, running down past her face in little avalanches. Each time, she paused, waiting for the flow to pass before moving again. Halfway along the traverse, one of her foot placements crumbled. A chunk of ice she'd trusted sheared away. For a heartbeat, her boot kicked at empty air, her center of gravity tipping outward. Her heart leapt into her throat. Instinct took over. Fingers crushed down harder. Shoulders locked. Her other foot pressed into the rock with everything she had. She swung her dangling leg back in, searching until her toe found another sliver of edge and settled. She didn't curse. She didn't shout. She inhaled once, slowly, then kept moving, because fear was a luxury. Function was survival. Below, as Holt and Vega climbed, a small slab of snow broke free from the wall somewhere between their position and Harper's. It slid, gathering more powder as it went, a white curtain peeling down the face. It passed the shelf, a fringe of snow dust whispering across the helmets of the men crouched there. One of them craned his neck up. "She's moving," he breathed. "Somebody's moving up there." Holt saw it too, a cascading line that wasn't natural, a signature of someone else on the wall. For the first time since he'd left the shelf, a grin broke through the tight focus on his face. "She's still alive," he muttered, muscles burning, fingers aching. "Of course she is." Between mortar volleys, when the air stilled for a moment, he cupped his hands to his mouth and shouted toward the upper face. "White Peak, we're coming to you." The words were ripped by the wind, carried up and out in fragments. Harper heard something, maybe her call sign, maybe just a jumble of syllables, and paused. She pressed her cheek against the rock, listening. She risked a glance down. Far below, two tiny shapes clung to the wall, moving slowly upward. Even at this distance, she recognized the rhythm of their climb. Trained, disciplined, dumb and brave in equal measure. She smiled, just barely. "You idiots," she whispered affectionately. Then she checked the direction of their ascent relative to her path. They were aiming for a point directly beneath her intended spur. "Good," she said softly. She shifted her weight and moved on. As she edged closer to the spur, the face steepened. The holds grew smaller, farther apart. She used her slings to create moments of security, looping them around small horns of rock, clipping in for a brief, tenuous safety as she reached beyond them, then unhooking and moving the loop along with her. It wasn't protection so much as psychological ballast, something between her and the drop. At last, with forearms burning and calves cramping, she reached up and felt nothing. No rock, no more wall, just cold air. The lip of the spay. She hooked her fingers over it, dug her feet into the last usable edges, and pulled herself up onto the knife edge. The spur was worse up close. Snow had drifted along its top, forming a fragile cornice that hung partially over empty space. The rock beneath was narrow, less than the span of her shoulders, with steep drops on both sides. She slid onto it on her stomach, spreading her weight like a climber crossing a sheet of thin ice. The cornice creaked, but held. From here, the world exploded open. She could see the mortar pit almost directly below her, tucked behind a rock shoulder. The machine gun nest, once half hidden, now presented its flank. The small command cluster stood out clearly, a knot of figures around radios and a camera near the crash site. And beyond, she saw, in sharp profile against the sky, the upper reaches of the wall where Holt and Vega were inching closer to her position. Harper Yuen slung her rifle, heart banging in her throat for the first time all day, not from fear of falling, but from the sudden weight of possibility. She had done it. She had found the impossible angle. She rolled onto her side, braced her elbows into the snow, and settled behind her cracked scope. The barrel poked out over the lip, the end hanging over a dizzying drop. The radio at her chest crackled faintly. She twisted the dial, tweaking power settings, angling the antenna along the line of sight between her and the climbing ranges. "Ranger element, this is White Peak," she said, voice low, words measured. "If you can hear me, click once." For a long moment, there was only static. Then, a single, faint click. She closed her eyes briefly in relief. "Good," she said. "You're insane. Stay that way. I'm about to start cutting this thing apart. When I say move, you move." She opened her eyes, let the reticle settle. The mountain roared around her. Below, mortars walked their pattern. The patrol hugged the shelf. Enemy fighters pushed toward the wreck, the hostage guides stumbling under their hands. Harper exhaled, banishing everything but the math of angles and distance. Time to rewrite the geometry of their trap. From the spur, the enemy's design finally made sense. They'd arranged their pieces like a chess player thinking 5 moves ahead. Mortar pit nestled in a hollow behind a rock, heavy machine gun on a leveled ledge commanding the shelf, riflemen in lateral cracks for crossfire, command node near the crash site, and a pair of climbers preparing to ascend a flank to scout or finish any survivors. Harper's position turned their lines into silhouettes. She settled her rifle into the snow, bipod legs biting into crust. The cracked scope lens forced her to back off on magnification, but the broader field of view was an advantage here. The minisight mounted off to the side gave her a backup aiming reference. She took inventory, not of things but of threats. First, the spotter beside the machine gun, their external brain, adjusting fire, calling corrections, searching for any sign of movement. Second, the radio operator in the command not near the wreck, headset on, hand on his MIC, the living link between mortar, gun, and jammer. Third, the mortar crew, working with a frightening cadence, their rounds walking closer to both the patrol and the crash site. Fourth, the machine gun team itself, assistant feeding the belt, gunner locked into a practiced rhythm. Fifth, the cluster near the wreckage where the squad leader of the enemy's cell, by posture, by the way others deferred to him, stood near the drone, barking orders. She murmured the list under her breath, anchoring it in memory. Priorities. Sequence. Effects. She keyed the compact radio. Ranger 1. Status, she whispered. Holt's voice came through. Faint, chopped by interference but recognizable. Halfway up, he said, holding on by fingernails. We've got eyes on the mortar pit from here if we lean out and squint. Don't lean, she said. You're my backup plan, not my body count. I'm about to hit their spotter. When the machine gun gets dumber, get ready to move your people on the shelf back 10 meters. There's a small notch in the cliff I can cover. Copy. I'll pass it along. You seeing the hostage by the wreck? I see him, she said. Is not my first shot. Silence. Then, understood. She placed the reticle a breath line above the enemy spotter's ear, accounting for the slight distortion of her damaged scope and the crosswind she felt on the spur. Her thumb brushed the safety off. She inhaled slowly, holding at the top, then let the air out until her chest just stopped moving. The noise of the mountain faded until all that existed was the thin black tick of the reticle and the small oval of the spotter's temple in the scope. She pressed the trigger. The rifle bucked, the recoil a familiar shove. The blast shockwave peeled a little more snow off the cornice. Down on the opposite ridge, the spotter's head snapped sideways. His glass fell from his hands, tumbling in slow motion down the slope as his body sagged. The machine gun's next burst went low and wild, churning snow well below the shelf. On the patrol's shelf, men flinched at the sudden change in impact. The gun that had been drawing deadly straight lines now scribbled like a distracted hand. Reddick's head popped up. They lost their eyes, he shouted. They lost their eyes. Harper didn't watch the spotter fall. She'd already shifted. The radio operator next. He was harder. He moved, ducking slightly at the sound of the machine gun's misfire. His hand went to his headset, body twisting as he barked at someone out of view. She adjusted, reading the angles, the slight drift in her cracked lens. She imagined the invisible line from barrel to target, how it would arc and drop. Her second shot cracked out. The round took him as he straightened, entering just below the edge of his helmet. He dropped like his strings had been cut, radio tumbling away. In the glass, she saw sudden confusion ripple through the enemy. Riflemen shouted at each other, heads turning. The mortar crew paused, unsure whether to continue. The machine gunner tried to adjust his aim on his own, but the rhythm had broken. Ranger 1. Now, Harper said into her MIC. On the wall below, Holt heard enough. He tilted his head toward the shelf and bellowed between breaths. Move back. 10 meters. Get to the notch. Now. Reddick heard him and, for once, didn't argue. Go, he roared, grabbing the wounded man's litter and hauling. You heard the crazy man on the wall. Move your asses. Under cover of the machine gun's wild, poorly guided fire, The patrol scrambled backward along the shelf, boots sliding, shoulders slamming into rock. A few rounds snapped close, but none found solid meat. They reached the notch, a slight inward curve of the cliff face that granted a hand-span more cover. It wasn't much. It was everything. The enemy commander realized something had shifted. He barked orders, gesturing toward the high ridge where their fire was coming from now. He jabbed a finger at two of his best fighters, climbers, by their harnesses, and pointed up. Harper saw them nod and peel off, heading toward a vertical crack that led toward her spur. At the same time, he grabbed the nearest mortar crewman, shouted in his ear, then jabbed his finger toward her position. Moments later, the mortar shifted. The next round didn't aim for the shelf or the crash site. It exploded in the air near her spur, a blind attempt to bracket her. Shrapnel tore through the sky, peppering snow and rock. Chunks of ice clattered around her, a few chunks slamming into her pack. The cornice shook under her ribs, shedding another layer of snow into the void. She flattened, teeth bared in a soundless snarl. Her rifle was partially buried. She swept snow away from the action with frantic, efficient motions. Another mortar round detonated closer. This one carved a chunk out of the rock just below her. The spur vibrated, sending a shock through her bones. "White Peak, they're throwing hate your way," Holt said, voice thin. "You good?" "I've been better," she said, "but so have they." She slithered sideways along the spur, sacrificing some of her stability for a new sight line. A narrow outcropping jutted a little farther over the mortar pit, just enough for a steeper angle. It also hung more directly over open space. She swallowed the instinct to hug safety and instead crawled toward the drop, elbows digging into thin snow, the cornice groaning under her. The view paid her back. From this angle, she saw straight down into the mortar pit. The lead mortar man was bent over the tube, another round in his hands, while his assistant stacked the next ones in a tidy line. "Third priority," she whispered. "Time to promote you." She aimed for the seam between shoulder and neck, where armor weakens and arteries run. Her finger broke the shot. The mortar man arched backward, the shell slipping from his fingers to land harmlessly in the snow. The assistant grabbed him, dragged him away, shouting for someone who no longer had a radio. The rounds walking toward the patrol stopped mid-pattern. The next one landed far off, a wasted burst of snow on a distant slope. Below her, Holt heard the lull and knew she'd gotten the mortar. He poured everything he had into the last meters of his climb, arms screaming, fingers raw. He reached a thin horizontal seam that he and Vega could straddle, a tiny ledge where two pairs of boots could just barely fit. They anchored in with what little hardware they had, bodies pressed into the rock, then angled their carbines down, firing controlled bursts at enemy riflemen who were trying to slide along cracks to flank the patrol. The enemy noticed. Fire started searching for them too, bits of rock and ice kicking up around their positions. The ambush was now a three-dimensional fight. Back on the opposite ridge, the machine gun assistant screamed as a round from Harper caught him in the hip, spinning him away from the weapon. The gunner grabbed the belt and tried to keep feeding, but coordination collapsed. The next burst went higher than before, tracing a useless line through empty air above the shelf. Harper took him in the next breath, placing a round through the exposed side of his helmet. The heavy gun fell silent, barrel smoking. She exhaled, barely allowing herself the smallest satisfaction. The big mouthpiece of their trap was gone. She keyed her radio. "Machine gun is down," she said. "Mortar is disrupted. Enemy comms node neutralized. You have a window." "Copy," Holt replied, chest heaving. His voice had an edge now, some tightness that wasn't just exertion. "Windows got bars, but we'll take it." Down by the crash site, the enemy commander roared in anger. In response, one of his allies unpacked a small quadcopter from a bag, slapped in a battery, and tossed it into the air. The drone zipped upward, rotors whining, its camera eye tilting, searching. They were done guessing. They were going to find her. Harper saw it rise, a black speck against the white sky. In seconds, it was level with her, then above, circling, its lens glinting as it tried to lock onto her position. She pressed herself lower, but she knew it was too late. From certain angles, the drone would see the curve of the spur, the barrel of her rifle, the dark line of her body. "Ranger 1, she said. "They've launched a drone. They're going to spot me, then send those climbers up my flank. I'll have to shift positions more often. You'll lose some of my cover." "Understood," Holt said. "We've got a solution for the drone." He looked at the sliver of rock under his boots. There was barely enough room to stand still, let alone maneuver. But the drone was going to make everyone's life shorter if someone didn't act. "Vega," he said, voice flat. "You see that bug?" Vega looked up, squinting. "Yeah. You're going to swat it. You have got to be kidding me. Target of opportunity, brother." When the drone drifted a little closer, Vega did something that would have gotten him yelled at in any climbing class. He straightened up as much as he could, shifting his center of gravity outward. Standing on a microscopic stance, he raised his carbine one-handed, the other hand white-knuckled on a hold above him. The drone found them. It banked toward their position, camera eye focusing. Vega fired 3 quick bursts. The first 2 missed, the traces streaking past. The third hit home. The drone jerked midair, one rotor shattering. It spun wildly, screaming as it tumbled down, smashing into a rock ledge and exploding into plastic shards. Harper smiled, a tight flash of teeth. Relief lasted exactly 1 heartbeat. The enemy climbers, already on their way up, had seen where Vega stood to take the shot. They adjusted their path accordingly, angling toward the narrow ledge where the Rangers clung. The enemy commander, realizing his eyes were blind again, focused on what he could still control. He grabbed the hard case with the encryption payload. He yanked the hostage guide closer, shoving him toward the wreck. He gestured to another fighter with a camera, ordering him to film the moment. They might not have the dramatic overhead footage they'd planned, but a shot of themselves seizing foreign technology and a captive on a snowfield would still play well. Harper's stomach turned. She shifted her scope. The commander's head and upper body were partially obscured by the hostage. They moved together, a constantly shifting tangle of shoulders, arms, and fabric. If she rushed it, she could easily hit the wrong chest. The moral weight of the shot settled into her hands. "Ranger 1, she murmured. "I have the commander and the payload in sight. He's using the guide as cover. I have a shot, but it's tight." Silence crackled, then Holt's voice, steady despite the height, the bullets, the fatigue. "Your call, White Peak. If you take him and miss the guide, you break this whole thing. If you hit the guide." "I know," she said. She waited, watching the rhythm of their movement. The commander gestured with his free hand, shouting something to someone off-frame. For a moment, his body twisted, the guide's shoulders shifting away from his chest. The hard case jutted out, his hand resting on it. Harper's world constricted again. Crosshaze, broken glass, breath, heartbeat. She aimed not at his center mass, but at the top corner of the case, where it met his ribs. If the round entered there, it would punch through the fragile metal and plastic, explode whatever electronics were inside, then carry into him. She let the breath trickle out. The shot broke. Down below, the commander jerked as the case shattered, shards of composite and circuitry bursting outward. He staggered backward, hand flying to his side, blood blooming against the white. The case's contents, circuit boards, storage modules, the guts of the encryption unit, sprayed into the snow, ruined. The hostage guide fell to his knees, screaming, hands flying up to protect his head. The camera operator flinched, lens jerking away from the scene. In that instant, Harper killed more than a man. She killed their narrative. Without the intact payload, their trophy was scrap. Without the commander's driving will and vision, the cell's cohesion began to unravel. Rifle fire on the opposing ridge became more erratic. Some fighters broke from their positions to drag the commander to cover. Others screamed into radios that no longer had an operator. A few, seeing the odds shift, began to slide down the slope, trying to disengage. On the shelf, Reddick felt the tension crack. "They are falling apart," he shouted. "They are falling apart." "Now!" Mason yelled. Move on the wreck. Secure the payload. Grab that guide. Under cover of continued fire from Harper and the Rangers above, the patrol surged forward along the shelf, moving past the worst of the kill zone into the relative open near the crash site. They reached the wreckage in a rush of panting breath, bits of debris crunching under their boots. Two soldiers grabbed the trembling guide and pulled him away from the wreck, hands up, mouths spilling reassurance in a language he half understood. Another scooped up the scarred remains of the hard case, shoving it into a pack. Harper and the Rangers coordinated fire like the teeth of a zipper closing. She targeted any enemy who tried to reassert control, while Holt and Vega suppressed those edging toward new flanking positions. On the wall, the enemy climbers drew close, faces flushed, eyes burning. They'd seen the drone go down, the machine gun die, the mortar fall silent, the commander drop, and they understood where the new axis of the fight lay. They wanted her. Holt saw them coming. "We've got company," he said calmly. "Keep them off me," Harper replied, as if asking him to cover her while she crossed the street. One climber reached for the seam where Holt's boots rested. Holt shifted one foot, stamping down hard on the man's hand. The enemy snarled, hand slipping, body swinging out for a heartbeat before he recovered, fingers scrabbling for a new hold. Vega leaned out dangerously, firing a short burst. One round punched into the climber's shoulder. He screamed, lost his grip, and fell. His partner looked down, watched him plummet, his shout fading into the canyon. For a moment, fear cracked through his anger. Harper used that heartbeat to finish another rifleman trying to get a shot at the evacuating patrol. Below, Mason's men began a fighting withdrawal along a different, safer slope Harper had identified, a snowfield angled away from the worst of the prepared avalanche paths, partially shielded from the remaining enemy fire by terrain. "White Peak, we're moving," Diaz yelled into his radio, not sure if anyone heard him, but needing to say it. Harper did. "I've got you," she said. "Stay in the low ground near the boulders. I'll cover your cross." Her round stitched a shield along their flanks, knocking down anyone who stepped out of cover to take advantage of their movement. Each shot cost a bullet they couldn't easily replace, but every enemy that fell opened the circle wider. Her magazine ran dry. She swapped it out with a quick, practiced motion. Hand steady, breath even. Fear existed in a quiet, separate part of her mind, but it never touched her fingers. A hand slapped up onto the edge of her spare. "Holtz!" He hauled himself over the lip, muscles shaking, face lined with exhaustion. For a second, he lay sprawled beside her, sucking in lungfuls of cold air like it was the sweetest thing he'd ever tasted. "Next time," he wheezed, "we bring rope." "Next time I stay home," she replied dryly, shifting the rifle so he wouldn't roll onto it. He laughed once, a short, incredulous bark. Then he rolled onto his side, eyes scanning the valley. "Hell of a view you picked," he said. "Mind if I borrow a corner?" He wedged himself against the spur, bracing his boots against a small protrusion, and angled his own carbine downward, adding his fire to hers. Together, they covered the patrol's retreat step by step, like guiding pieces off a burning board. Ammo ticked down. Enemies broke, some retreating entirely, others making desperate, uncoordinated rushes that ended under their sights. By the time the last American boot cleared the worst of the canyon and angled toward safer ground, the enemy ambush looked nothing like the perfect, disciplined trap it had been an hour earlier. The mortar pit was a mess of blood and abandoned rounds. The machine gun lay silent, half buried in snow. The command node was scattered, its leader down, its recording gear in pieces. And on a narrow spur of rock high above, a sniper and two rangers, fingers numb and bodies shaking, had turned a perfectly laid kill zone into a broken, bleeding mess. The fight wasn't over, but the battle for the narrative, for the symbol, had just swung in a different direction. The ride back to the outpost was full of noise and silence. Inside the helicopter, men shouted over the engine, over the rotor wash, over the ringing in their own ears. Some laughed too loud, the kind of laughter that came with relief and shock twined together. Others sat hunched, staring at the floor, hands flexing around weapons they hadn't quite convinced themselves they could put down. The wounded ranger lay on a stretcher, pale but conscious, the medic hovering over him, checking vitals, adjusting four lines. The rescued mountain guide sat wrapped in a blanket, eyes wide, clutching the edges like a lifeline. The recovered drone payload, what was left of it, sat in a scarred metal case at their feet, edges bent, latch half broken. It had survived more than it had any right to. Harper sat near the rear, back against the vibrating bulkhead, helmet in her lap. Her fingers were bandaged where the rock had bitten through gloves. There was a bruise forming along one cheekbone where a small shard of stone had clipped her. Windburn had reddened the skin along her jaw. She watched the others in quiet, taking in the way they moved, the way their shoulders hunched, the way their eyes flicked to the door as if expecting the mountain to reach in and grab them back. Holt sat across from her, head tipped back, eyes closed. Every so often, he cracked one lid to look at her, as if making sure she was still there and not a trick of adrenaline. When the helicopter settled back onto the outpost pad and the ramp dropped, the cold slapped them again, reality reasserting itself with a sharp smell of fuel and snow. They filed into the main building where the debrief room waited. Same folding table, same buzzing heater, same stained walls. The maps were still on the board, lines of their intended route mocking the path they had actually walked. Intelligence officers hovered at the edges, already pulling memory cards from recovered enemy cameras, examining the shattered pieces of the hard case. Technicians laid out the drone's guts, cataloging what had survived, what had been destroyed. Screens blinked with raw feeds from earlier in the day. It took time for everyone to sit. Some lowered themselves into chairs like old men, joints protesting. Others paced, unable to be still. Harper took a seat at the far end of the table, near the wall. It was where she always sat, close enough to speak if needed, far enough that no one was staring at her by default. Mason stood at the head again, but the energy was different. The confidence of the morning was gone, replaced by a tightness around his eyes. "Let's get this over with," he said quietly. "We're all tired." The debrief started with the failures. Route selection. The decision to treat the High Saddle's emptiness as good news. The over-reliance on satellite link confirmation. The complacency that came from having walked that valley more than once without incident. Harper listened, face unreadable, as the slide showed their planned path overlaid with evidence of enemy preparations they'd missed, trenches, cleared fields of fire, in-place tripods. The intel officer running the slideshow pointed to an image. "They had weeks to set this up," he said. "Captured footage and intercepted messages indicate this was a foreign-backed cell testing our response time and our patterns. Their primary objective was to seize the encryption payload from the drone and broadcast a forced retreat from this valley. They had multiple camera positions set up for it." He clicked to the next slide. It showed the shattered hard case, snow-stained around it, the enemy commander crumpled nearby. "This shot," the officer said, tapping the image, "changed that. The payload storage modules were destroyed. The camera filming the scene was hit as well. Without this, even if our people had all made it back, they'd still have had the trophy they wanted. Instead, they have broken fragments and their leader in a grave." Mason's gaze traveled down the table to Harper for the first time since the room had filled. She didn't look up right away, still studying the imagery. He cleared his throat. "Let's talk about how we got out of that canyon at all," he said. Reddick spoke first, in a gruff, embarrassed tone. He talked about the moment the radios went dead, the first burst from the machine gun. The mortar walks. He admitted, grudgingly, that Harper had called something in seconds before it all went sideways, and that he'd mentally written it off as paranoia until the mountain erupted. Holt and Vega spoke next, their words short and factual. They described the decision to climb, not as heroics but as a calculated risk in the absence of better options. They outlined the holds, the ledges, the angle they were aiming for. Holt mentioned, almost as an afterthought, the diagonal traverse he'd seen above them, the one Harper had taken without rope. The intel officer's pens paused. Harper remained quiet until someone finally asked her. "Staff Sergeant," the senior analyst said, "walk us through your perspective. From the moment you reached Overwatch." She did. She spoke in measured sentences, voice steady. She mentioned the anomalies she'd seen on the imagery that morning. The glint of glass, the outlines of pre-dug positions, the interference on her tablet, the rocket that erased her route. She didn't embellish the fear when the rope went. She simply noted that her primary descent became non-viable. She described the alternate route she'd identified, her decision to traverse, the way she'd use her limited gear to create a position that opened up the enemy's architecture. She laid out her target ladder as if reciting a grocery list: spotter, radio operator, mortar, machine gun crew, commander, and payload. Each choice linked to a specific tactical effect. She did not call herself brave. She did not talk about her hands shaking or the cornice groaning under her. She spoke about angles and timing and how long she estimated they had before the enemy adapted. The room was quiet when she finished. Even the heater seemed to pause. The intel officer broke the silence. Without that shot on the commander and the case, he said, we'd be dealing with a very different outcome right now. They were prepared to sacrifice fighters just to get that footage. Denying that objective was as important as getting our people out. Someone at the table shifted uncomfortably. Another cleared his throat. Harper sat still, eyes on the image of the shattered case. She felt the weight of what that shot had meant, the way she'd threaded the round past the guide, the risk. That story lived in her hands more than in any slide. The debrief turned to recommendations, to changes in route planning protocols, to increased scrutiny on empty terrain. There was talk of new training packets on enemy jamming, the need for more redundancy, more skepticism. Through it all, Harper said little. Her role, as she saw it, was complete. She had pointed where she needed to point, before, during, and after. When the meeting finally broke, men stood slowly, stretching, wincing as muscles complained. Some slapped each other on the shoulder, murmuring half-hearted jokes. The Rangers slipped out together, still moving like men who hadn't fully come back down from the wall. Harper lingered a moment, collecting her notebook and tablet, sliding them into her bag. Reddick approached, hand wrapped in a fresh bandage. He hesitated, then said, "You called it, up there." "I didn't listen." She shrugged once. "You listened when it counted." He looked at her for a moment, seeing not just the quiet sniper in the corner, but the person who'd crawled onto a blade of rock to pull his people out of an impossible geometry. "Next time you say a rock looks wrong," he said, "I'll treat it like it's pointing a gun at me." A faint smile ghosted across her lips. "Deal." He left. Outside, the sky was bruised purple, evening slipping over the mountains. The ridges loomed black against the last light, White Peak silhouette jagged on the horizon. Harper stepped out into the cold, breath fogging. For a moment, she stood near the door, listening to the muffled voices from inside, the hum of generators, the distant clatter of dishes from the mess. Then she walked out past the last row of berries, onto a small rise just beyond the wire. The snow crunched under her boots. The air bit at her cheeks. Up above, stars were beginning to prick holes in the darkening sky. She stopped where the ground fell away, hands in her pockets, and looked up at the ridge that had tried to kill them and had almost succeeded. From here, the spur she'd used was invisible, just one more irregularity in a sea of stone. The rope's absence couldn't be seen. None of the details that had nearly cost her everything were obvious. All anyone would see, looking from below, was the outline of a mountain and the knowledge of what had happened there. Footsteps crunched behind her. Mason came to stand a few feet away, hands shoved deep into his jacket. For a moment, he said nothing. "I looked at those images this morning," he said finally, voice softer than in the briefing room. "I saw what you were pointing at and chose not to let it change the plan." Harper kept her gaze on the ridge. "We all make choices," she said. "We just don't get to pick the test." He let out a breath that fogged in front of him. "What did you see, really, out there, on that screen? The stuff you didn't have time to put into words." She thought about it, the blank heat signatures, the new tracks, the unnatural emptiness, the patterns of absence that had screamed louder than presence. "I saw a place that used to breathe," she said, suddenly holding its breath. "I saw tracks leading not away from us, but toward where we'd like to walk. I saw a saddle that had always been messy get perfect. Perfect, he repeated. Nature's lazy, she said. It doesn't make perfect lines. People do. He nodded slowly. We won't ignore that again. They stood in silence for a few heartbeats. You know, he said, they're going to write this up as a case study, responding to a complex ambush or some such. There'll be diagrams, little arrows. Your name will be in there somewhere as overwatch element. She huffed a quiet laugh. Could be wise. Could be a cautionary tale. It is, he said. For me. He hesitated, then added, for what it's worth, I'm glad you didn't die on that rock I tried to pretend was safe. She looked at him then, really looked. There was no defensiveness in his face now, only tired honesty. I'm glad you let the crazy men climb, she said. He smiled once, then turned back toward the warmth of the buildings, leaving her alone on the rise. The wind tugged at her jacket, pulling strands of hair loose. The mountain loomed, dark and vast, caring nothing for their plans, their debriefs, the neat lines on screens. Harper watched White Peak until her eyes watered from the cold. The narrator's voice returned, soft and sure, like a closing door. They left her stranded on a mountain peak once, it said. After that day, they never again forgot who was watching the ridge. She turned at last and walked back toward the lights, another quiet figure slipping into the flow of men. Tomorrow, there would be new missions, new maps, new valleys to cross. But up on White Peak, the story of what one overlooked specialist, a broken scope, and two ropeless rangers had done in a kill zone of snow and stone would hang in the air like frost, unseen, but changing the way everyone breathed.